We've touched upon the first national crisis the Constitution suffered, that being the Whiskey Rebellion in the early 1790s. We've mentioned about it in passing in multiple editions of Retracing History, but in the next coming episodes, we're going to truly delve deep into the actual events and people behind the Whiskey Rebellion. And the best place to start off is essentially the cradle of rebellion, if we're here in the early 1790s, and that is Washington, Pennsylvania, county seat of the same region of the same name. We're walking right up to the house of the man that many consider the leader of the rebel movement in 1794, Mr. David Bradford. So we're going to learn a little bit about Bradford's involvement with the rebellion, and also we're going to talk just a little bit more about the rebellion itself, because the Bradford House Association got two properties right here in downtown Washington, and I want to take a peek at both of them. David Bradford was born in New Jersey in 1755, but he spent most of his childhood and early adulthood in Charlestown, Maryland, where it appears he had some involvement in the American Revolution. I can't confirm that was with local militia, or he was sworn in with a regular regiment that came out of Charlestown, but in any case, he is credited as being a veteran of the American Revolution, and even had some interactions with the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, toward the end of the American Revolution, Mr. Bradford is going to move into the newly formed Washington County, Pennsylvania. That was created in 1781 in the southwest corner of what we know today as the state of Pennsylvania. So he's moving into this brand new county, and since you got a brand new county, it means you have a whole new county government to establish. And Bradford and many other people that move into this region in the 1780s take advantage of that and make themselves into positions of affluent power. In Bradford's case, he's going to become the Deputy Attorney General of Washington County by 1783. He'll also serve a stint with the local county militia in 1782 before the end of the American Revolution. Now, Bradford had built up quite a bit of wealth for him throughout his life, and kind of jumping ahead of our story, he owned a lot of land across the United States, not just in western Pennsylvania, but in Virginia, in Maryland, and even eventually in Louisiana as well. So he is going to build quite a bit of wealth for himself, which is going to allow him to establish quite the fancy residence in Washington, Pennsylvania, where he's practicing as Attorney General. The house here is going to begin construction around 1786. It'll be finished in 1788. Around the same time, he is going to marry Elizabeth Porter. And while this house has 22 windows, why is that impressive? Well, in the 1780s, there was a windows tax on people in the United States of America. So you had to pay a tax per window you had. So a lot of houses did not have much windows because they considered it a light source, similar to how your electrical bill today would be. That was the window tax for the 1700s. Well, he has 22 windows and he's willing to pay those taxes. There's also a room tax. And let me tell you, the rooms in this house are massive. They're massive not just because it's a house in the 1700s, but it's a house on the frontier in the 1700s. And yeah, this is all intentional. Bradford is showing his clients or any potential adversaries who want to fight against the law to show how much wealth the Deputy Attorney General has. Do you really want to mess around with this individual? All told, his house costs, he estimated, around $4,250, though he claimed it had not cost him a penny in his mind. Now, being Deputy Attorney General means that you have to make sure the law is upheld for the people in Washington County. He is looking out for the best of interest for his constituents, for his friends, for his neighbors. And when they begin complaining about a certain whiskey tax beginning in 1791, he is going to listen out to them because it does impact them. And also, He himself doesn't want to pay the whiskey tax. Nobody in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania wants to pay Alexander Hamilton's whiskey tax, which is imposed by U.S. Congress beginning in March of 1791. Now, we've talked about the whiskey tax before here on Retracing History. Not to go into detail, but essentially, whiskey to people in the eastern cities was a luxury item. It was a tax they were willing to pay because it was something they could live without. Well, live without, they say. But for the people out west, it was a form of hard currency. It was much more practical to ship whiskey over the mountains to be sold at market than it was to ship ears of corn or grain or other crops. So distilling whiskey was a way to make an income so you would survive. And now that is being taxed. Your own currency, in a sense, is being taxed. And that infuriated a lot of the farmers around the Pittsburgh region. And we can only imagine that throughout the early 1790s, as the taxes began to be imposed, as Western Pennsylvanians are making their frustrations known to the federal government about it, initially through petitions to amend the tax. Then it's going to start turning into isolated incidents of violence with tar and feathering at tax collectors, as well as agents that come out from the Treasury Department to try to figure out who is and who isn't paying their taxes. A lot of these guys are going to go directly to Bradford and appeal to him because he's one of the leading figures of the law in the land. And they're asking them, how is this legal? They're asking Bradford, how is it legal for the federal government to basically destroy my livelihood? Why will they not amend this tax? Don't they see what's causing? And our tour guide here actually provided me a fun little anecdote that you can only imagine is very dusty, dirty, gringy farmer, hasn't bathed in like a week or two. He comes out the door, smacking on the door, and then Bradford opens. Bradford's well-groomed, well-polished, nice clothes, and he invites this disgruntled farmer in and invites him to a nice cold drink of whiskey sitting in this massive parlor room. And, that farmer's just looking around gobsmacked like, what have I gotten myself into? Now, I forgot to mention a little bit more about Bradford, at least on the political side of Bradford. Mr. Bradford had formed Washington County's Democratic Society. And these Democratic Societies were formed around the time the U.S. Constitution was adopted. These are folks that they support the establishment of the Constitution and a central federal government, but they are very suspicious of the politicians in power and fear that the U.S. Constitution could very easily be manipulated into defaulting the United States of America back to the 13 British colonies with an old school aristocracy. So these democratic societies formed to try to be vigilant, to be politically vigilant to any potential chance of an aristocracy coming to rise. And well, the Whiskey Rebellion looks like an aristocracy is coming to rise in the eastern cities. I also want to mention that these democratic societies tend to be very supportive of the revolutionary activities of men like Robespierre during the French Revolution. That's going to become important. So Bradford is going to be involved in a lot of these meetings in the early 1790s in taverns around Pittsburgh. Delegates from all parts of southwestern Pennsylvania come together who have an issue with the whiskey tax, and they hope they can find the easiest course of action to resolve it. But almost immediately you got a divide amongst these delegates. You got radicals who want full-on removal of the tax, and they'll do anything necessary to do it. And you got your moderates who are more willing to compromise with the federal government and they view the federal government as the ultimate power in the land. Bradford is technically a radical, but he does not speak with his words. What he's rather going to do, he's going to speak with his wealth. All he has to merely say is vote yay whenever a radical says something, and everybody's going to turn and say, hey, that man with the fancy house down in Washington just backed me, and I was in his parlor room, and he got a lot of money, so I am glad that he's on my side. So Bradford's very quiet in his support for a more radical course of action to end the whiskey tax. But this strategy of silent support for the radical cause is going to come to an abrupt end in July of 1794. In July of 1794, the federal government had absolutely enough of Pittsburghers refusing to pay their whiskey tax. And they were further furious that it was generally allowed in places like Washington County for people to do acts of violence against federal officials trying to enforce the tax or trying to arrest somebody who had attacked a federal official. So in July 1794, a U.S. Marshal is going to show up with summons to federal courts for key individuals. Now, most of these he serves quietly. However, when he gets close to Washington County and he's being guided by the revenue collector of the Pittsburgh region, a guy by the name of John Neville, well, they're going to get into some hot water. There's going to be a dispute over one of the summons for courts. Shots are going to be fired, and some of the Washington County militia is going to surround Neville's home, and a 2-day firefight will ensue. Eventually, it will go from 30 rebels to over 500 rebels opening fire on Neville's house, which becomes guarded by a dozen federal soldiers out of Pittsburgh. 2 people are killed, and Neville's house is burned to the ground at the end of it. Now, these guys were in trouble. They had just fired at federal officials. They were shooting at federal soldiers. There are going to be consequences. And there's going to be a meeting hosted just a week later on July 23rd at the Mingo Creek Church. This is a Presbyterian church that's located not too far from Washington, Pennsylvania. And it has been the mustering grounds for what is known as the Mingo Creek Association, the most anti-federal militia in southwestern Pennsylvania, who did play a role in the shooting against Neville's house. They're going to call a massive conference with all of those delegates have been debating how we're going to resolve the whiskey tax, and the radicals have, well, there's no microphone. They have the podium, they have the pulpit, and the moderates really feel uncomfortable trying to talk against them. They feel that their lives are at risk should they speak about any further compromise. And it's at this moment Bradford makes a sudden shift from quiet support of rebel movements to full-on vocal support and willing to lead these rebels in battle. Now, a few days after the Mingo Creek Church meeting, and at this point the radical faction of the Whiskey Rebels are in full control over politics in southwestern Pennsylvania, Bradford is going to be involved in a plot to apprehend federal mail that's being transported between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia on the old Forbes Military Road. 2 rebels are going to grab the mailman, grab his satchel, and then are going to take it to a tavern in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, where Bradford and a few other leaders of the rebellion are going to gather around and sift through the mail. And like, this mail is coming from big names. We got Henry Knox's signature, we got Alexander Hamilton's signature, we even got George Washington's signature on these orders. And essentially these documents they're essentially used as justification for Bradford to call a rallying of all militia in the area to debate what are they going to do about the federal stronghold in Pittsburgh. On August 1st and 2nd, 1794, several thousand people are reportedly gathering at Braddock's Field. Now, this had once been the site of the Battle of Monongahela, otherwise known as Braddock's defeat during the French and Indian War. Oddly enough, the battle occurred the same year Bradford was born. And here we are over 30 years later, and some of those guys are probably veterans of the French and Indian War, albeit now they're up there in age. And a lot of folks who know family members that had fought and possibly died on that soil, they're now gathering on that battlefield in one massive militia muster. Now, I've heard anywhere from 1,500 to 7,000 had gathered, and there's no way of knowing the exact numbers. So all these guys are going to organize at Braddock's Field. Bradford comes onto the field in full pomp and circumstance. He has plumes of feathers. He got a sword. He's in a military uniform. Where he got it from, we don't truthfully know. We don't know if it's some old militia attire, some nice militia uniform he was wearing. I've even heard people say that he was wearing medals, and where he got those medals, I have no idea. So Bradford shows up and appears to be in full support of violent recourse against federal soldiers stationed in Pittsburgh's Fort Fayette to remove them from the region, so all of southwestern Pennsylvania is under rebel control and no longer under the authority of the federal government. That's on August 1st. By August 2nd, everybody had drunk a lot of whiskey. and they had eaten a lot of food, and they had fired off a lot of gunpowder. And again, this is where we can debate, did Bradford intentionally become the leader of the Whiskey Rebellion, become so radical so quickly to try to kind of use up all of the rebel movement's energy? Because this is a populist movement, essentially. You know, this is a snowball effect. Eventually, they're going to run out of steam, right? So let's grab the bull by the horns and let's just make them speed run a rebellion before they do some serious damage. Again, we can never know for certain. In any case, Bradford, by August 2nd, he's going to find all the rebels pretty hungover, but are still like, yeah, we're going to go fight the Federal Army. So Bradford is convinced, initially he claims he wants to go to Pittsburgh, force the exile of a list of individuals that have been supportive of the whiskey tax, and then second, force the local militia in Pittsburgh to join the Whiskey Rebellion, and thereby all soldiers in southwestern Pennsylvania are under the authority of the Whiskey Rebel movement led by David Bradford. General David Bradford at this point, by the way. He's now a general now, apparently. Well, some other folks involved, one of the most prominent figures is Hugh Henry Brackenridge, who's a lawyer who lives in Pittsburgh, and he has been at all of these meetings just like Bradford, but he is much more timid about what the rebels are doing, and he does greatly fear the power of the federal government. So he is going to talk Bradford down into not doing his initial plan on Pittsburgh. Instead says, let's just make a demonstrative march past Fort Fayette, show the tiny federal garrison inside that we have the power to take them at any moment, but we are very generous and we are offering you a second chance if you just stop the rebel tax. So the whole idea is they march down into Pittsburgh. These rebels led by Bradford do march on Pittsburgh, march right past Fort Fayette, and then turn to the left, and then head down to the Monongahela River, march back out of Pittsburgh, where a massive buffet was awaiting them of food that was prepared all night by the women of Pittsburgh, hoping that if they can feed these rebel soldiers and get them all liquored up, that they would have no stomach for any more violence. And, well, it worked. Pittsburgh is still standing today. But the rebellion was not over. Now, further meetings are going to be hosted amongst the delegates representing this Whiskey Rebellion. They're going to meet in August, and September, and October at a place known as Parkinson's Ferry, aka Whiskey Point. Now it's the community of Monongahela, Pennsylvania. And they're debating, what's our next course of action, General Bradford? What are we going to do next? And Bradford is starting to get some cold feet because it's becoming apparent that federal army that everybody's been talking about could possibly raise to suppress this rebellion, it's coming. And it's commanded by General George Washington himself, who, of course, is president at this point. And if you want to learn more about that federal army and what Washington was doing during the Whiskey Rebellion, check out our video about his headquarters during this event. In any case, Bradford begins to become a little bit more mild in his talks. He at one point starts to talk down the rebels and say, well, on second examination, when we inventoried our munitions, if we use all this up, the U.S. Army, commanded by Anthony Wayne, fighting the Indians out in the Northwest Territory, they're going to be without ammunition, and they might be defeated like St. Clair was a few years earlier. And do we really want another major defeat at the hands of these Native Americans? Maybe we should give the munitions to him instead. Now after you'd already organized militias, armed them, and threatened to march on a federal fort. Yeah, you're not really going to be able to turn the tide at this point, Bradford. The reason he's probably doing this, he knows he's in trouble. He knows that means his family's at risk. Initially, he was worried about the radical violence that could be put against him should he not support the rebellion. What would happen to his family? Now he's thinking about the federal army is coming to suppress this rebellion, which means they're going to want to go to the home of the general of the rebel army. So Bradford becomes more and more cool in his rhetoric, which starts upsetting a lot of the radicals in the Whiskey Rebellion movement. But by September, once we get to October, when the federal army is just about 50 miles from getting into Pittsburgh, at that point, Bradford essentially turns the keys over to other figures, and he's beginning to organize his evacuation from Pittsburgh. Now, when the Federal Army arrives in the Pittsburgh area, they're not going to find that rebel army that had marched on Pittsburgh in August. Rather, in mid to late October, there's no army. There's no rebels out there, firearms. While there's some isolated episodes of guys, sticking it to the man, essentially, most of them have gone into hiding, either in their homes or have outright left the area. And Alexander Hamilton is here in Pittsburgh. He is really looking forward to serving summons for arrest to a number of individuals he's heard their names about for years. And top on his priority is David Bradford, the general of the rebel army. However, when Alexander Hamilton comes here to Bradford's house in Washington, Pennsylvania one night, knocking on the door, he's only going to find Elizabeth Bradford answering and saying, "I don't know where my husband went. He just walked out." Now, there's been a popular myth going around for years that Bradford, in mere minutes before federal troops stormed his house, that he's going to leap from his window, leap into a carriage awaiting him, and go on a wild ride out of Washington County to the Ohio River. In reality, he walked out of the house, said goodbye to his wife and his children, told them that he would see them one day soon, but for now he had to go into hiding to save them. He is going to ride out of Washington, Pennsylvania, get on a barge in the Ohio River, and float for a mostly quiet voyage all the way down to Spanish Louisiana. Now, Hamilton is greatly discouraged that he didn't get Bradford, but he is going to round up some 200 individuals he's going to serve their arrests for. And this is known as the Dreadful Night, November 13th, when federal forces storm houses all around Pittsburgh, drag people from their sleep, and essentially for the next week, 2 weeks, they're basically held in a makeshift jail without proper provisions in November. It's cold out and they're underclothed. This was probably the darkest hour in Pittsburgh history, at least for the 1700s, and definitely soured everybody else all the more against the federal government. You weren't helping matters, you're just making it worse. And eventually what's going to happen is, although 200 men are rounded up, most of them, they don't have any evidence on them to actually warrant their arrest, to take them to stand trial. Ultimately, 20 men are going to have some evidence put against them, and Hamilton feels confident enough can take them back to Philadelphia. But eventually, of those 20, most of them are either their cases are outright dismissed from the get-go, get acquitted of all charges, and eventually only 2 men are found guilty of treason. And those 2 men will actually be pardoned by President Washington shortly thereafter. But one person who was never pardoned by Washington was David Bradford. See, George Washington, he knew who David Bradford was, at least by name, and he was aware that Bradford had some service in the American Revolution. And Washington was furious at the fact that one of his own soldiers who had served under him, whose reason he spent all their years trying to create the United States of America, was willing to lead an army to destroy it. And that did not sit well with Washington. And ultimately, Washington never pardoned David Bradford. It would only be John Adams who would pardon David Bradford in the late 1790s. But by then, Bradford had no intentions of returning to Washington, Pennsylvania, and returning to his former occupation. Rather than return to Washington, Pennsylvania once he had been pardoned, he decided to stay where he was hiding in, which was Spanish Florida, technically a part of modern-day Louisiana, which was then Spanish Florida was considered. He is going to come in 1795, initially to Washington, PA, to check in on his family. Also want to point out, 9 months after this visit, a 4th child was born to Elizabeth by the name of David Jr. He's going to come back in the late 1790s then to take the whole family from Pennsylvania and remove to this plantation he had established in Spanish Florida. He's going to come back one final time to Washington, PA, to sell off his house, sell off any assets he still had in the area before deciding to spend the rest of his days in the Gulf of Mexico. And eventually that place would also become part of the United States of America, although it was not easy. Now, we know about the Louisiana territory being sold by the French in 1803, but there were still Spanish holdouts and vestiges in that territory, and there was talks at one point by the Jefferson administration of seeing if Bradford would be willing to negotiate a uprising amongst the American people in Baton Rouge. I guess Bradford being involved with starting rebellions, I guess it just goes hand in hand. That's what he was known for by the federal government. However, Bradford was too sick at this point to do such a risky assignment. He'll end up contracting yellow fever, and he will pass away in 1807. I also want to mention that a plantation he established becomes rechristened the Myrtles Plantation, which is considered one of, if not the most haunted bed and breakfast places in the United States of America. Good job, Bradford. You're still haunted down there. To sum it all up, David Bradford had failed to lead Western Pennsylvania in rebellion and secession from the United States of America. But becoming the leader of the Whiskey Rebellion allowed him to draw a major threat to the federal government and made people realize, the whiskey tax, maybe it's not a good idea. And eventually that tax would be repealed, but not until Thomas Jefferson took power. And Thomas Jefferson took power in large part due to a lot of people being upset by both the rebel and federal actions to handle this whiskey rebellion situation. In a sense, a lot of these whiskey rebels are going to go on to become part of the Democratic Republicans. They're going to get Jefferson in power. This is also going to start the two-party system, which the United States of America's politics does, unfortunately, still operate under today in 2024. Now, shortly after the time that David Bradford sold his property, there were a few modifications made. The most noteworthy is that the old log summer kitchen, which had burned down twice, by the early 1800s, the property owners replaced it with a stone annex. And on the second floor of that stone annex, Rebecca Davis Harding is going to be born. She's going to go on to become a prominent realist writer and journalist in mid-19th century America. So there's actually two historical figures in American history tied with the structure. It would serve many different functions throughout the 19th and 20th century. The tour guides told me this at one point was a Christmas tree shop, which is one of the most interesting uses of a historic house I've thus heard about on Retracing history. But it did eventually start to fall into decline as the town of Washington, PA built into a small city and completely surrounded this property. And a movement was had by local members of the community to preserve the house. This became known as the Bradford House Historical Association. And with the purchase of the property by the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission in the early 1960s, the association went about in restoring it back to its 18th century appearance. And ever since the mid-1960s, this house has been open for tours. This is a museum about life, fancy living on the Pennsylvania frontier in the late 18th century, as well as a place to learn about David Bradford's prominent role in the Whiskey Rebellion and his involvement in shaping the United States of America how we know it as today. Alright, so that's going to do it here from the David Bradford House, the home of the so-called leader of the Whiskey Rebellion here in Washington, Pennsylvania. If you enjoyed learning about this story as much as I have, be sure to head over to the Bradford House Association's website. Link will be in the description below so you can learn more about the story of this house as well as what's going on over in the Whiskey Rebellion Education Center. Oh, get back over my shoulder. There it is. And if you want to go and support their efforts, by all means, this is a volunteer operation by the looks of things. Admission was free to get into both. It's currently covered by generous donors. If you want to explore more videos like this, the first thing you need to do, hit the like button down below. Let the YouTube algorithm know that you do want to see historical videos on the TubeU platform. Then, if you want to follow us on our almost weekly adventures, be sure to subscribe here to Readout Productions here on YouTube as well as Rumble. And if you want to go the extra mile and supporting us, keeping us on the road, you can buy me a cup of coffee. Our Ko-fi link for donations is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.